All right, it's been a minute and we have a quorum of participants, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Welcome to today's webinar on the shared benefits of low impact commodities in animal feed and biofuels. Traditionally, these sectors have operated independently, but with evolving market dynamics and a rise in regenerative programs, we've seen a collective shift towards collaboration in service of more resilient value chains. In today's conversation, our experts will dive into efforts in resilience between these two industries and share some strategies for driving more holistic progress. We'll chat through the positive impacts of regenerative practices on crop and feed supply chains and some strategies on creating more synergy between the two. And of course, we'll do our best to leave time for questions and for open conversation at the end. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Bill Salas is our moderator. He's the co founder and chief strategy officer at Regrow. Bill has more than 30 years of experience in environmental science and business leadership and is highly regarded throughout the industry for his expertise in remote sensing and biogeochemical modeling. Susie Friedman is the Senior Director of Food Policy at WWF. She has over 25 years of experience in advancing climate, wildlife, soil, and water solutions through innovative partnerships, sustainable ag, and strategic policy development in the food sector. And finally, Matt Durler is Managing Director of Climate Smart Sorghum at National Sorghum Producers. Matt leads carbon friendly farming programs that create low carbon feedstocks for ethanol biorefineries and was also responsible for developing the commercialization strategy of feed products created with ICM technologies. I will take a step back and I'll let you take the reins, Bill. Thank you all again for being here.
Thank you, Lainey, and welcome to all of our participants for the webinar today. As Lainey sort of outlined, we're going to talk a little bit about how sustainable solution can evolve the biofuel and feed industries looking to take a more proactive approach on integrating resilient farm strategies across shared landscapes. I think I'm looking forward to having this conversation with Susie and Matt as they are experts on the fuel and feed sectors and can provide a very valuable perspective. I think that will be interesting to all the participants. So let's kick off the conversation. So let's start with maybe a brief intro and your experience with respect to your work in both the biofuel and feed industry supply chains. And maybe I'll start with Susie, and then Susie, you can pass the mic to Matt, if you would.
Sure. Thanks so much for including me today. So as you said, Susie Friedman, and I'm Senior Director for Food Policy at World Wildlife Fund. And I spent much of my career working on ag sustainability, first at Environmental Defense Fund and now at World Wildlife Fund. And throughout this time, I've worked with stakeholders and partners across the conservation and agricultural communities and value chains, working on landscapes that dominate production in the US. And a couple of crops that dominate our landscapes are corn and soy, and biofuels and feed consume the majority of corn and soy produced in the US. So how these crops are produced, how they're used, and the policy and market signals affecting them are essential to the sustainability and resilience of our landscapes and our food and agricultural system. And while we've seen significant improvement and progress in conservation efforts across the ag system, ensuring we have an agricultural system that is truly resilient in the face of increasingly extreme and unpredictable weather and policy shifts, as well as meeting the nutritional needs of a growing population, means we need to build on existing progress and make significant additional improvements in resilient agricultural production for soil health, diversification, precision management, precision conservation, and addressing land use change. So excited to be part of the conversation today.
Thank you, Susie. Matt, if you would.
Yeah, happy to be here as well. Appreciate the invite. Matt Durler, Managing Director of Climate Smart Sorghum, also lead our farm programs here at National Sorghum Producers. I guess my journey in this space kind of started about 42 years ago. Fourth generation farmer, and it's kind of been ever evolving since then. And you know, when you think about the biofuel space and you think about animal agriculture, it's really a systems approach. And these ethanol plants or biodiesel plants, a lot of times are the hub of local production agriculture. And our approach is, you know, how do we meet farmers where we are? How do we take this journey? You know, interestingly enough, I always gave my dad a hard time that we went to no-till because I went to college. You know, we pulled plows for decades, and that's all I would do when I was in high school. It's farm all summer long. And we realized there was a better way to do it, you know, and started transitioning to managing residue. And I've spent most of my career in ethanol in one facet or another at this point. Managed an ethanol plant for a while, a lot of time in farm programs, and then moving the co-products out the backside. But really, it's an integrated approach because the same things that matter to an ethanol plant particularly matter to beef and dairy producers. And when you think about how those co-products filter through, you can't really separate the whole system. And it's an opportunity to make the system more efficient by layering things together.
Thank you, Matt. So, I mean, I think that tees up a lot of the themes that we'll discuss during this webinar. So, quick question for you, Matt. In your role with National Sorghum Producers and the importance of sorghum as a key feedstock for both biofuels and an energy source for livestock, what do you see as sort of the key intersection points for us to think about as we try to bring these two supply chains for a shared valuation of the landscape and environmental benefits and a more resilient set of industries across both biofuel and livestock?
Well, sustainability has become a real buzzword, but how you define that really matters. And at the very core of it, it's just doing more with less. And in the arid part of the country where most of the sorghum is planted, this is about durability. This is about resilience of supply chains, and it's about the integration of how we support all the value-added agriculture out here. Sorghum is an important role as a rotation crop here. We still have more bushels of corn even in Kansas going into ethanol supply chains than we do milo. But when you think about the intersection between sorghum and wheat and beans and even corn in these systems, it allows that biodiversity that really adds to the resilience and de-risks production here. So in a lot of senses, the ethanol plant has become the middleman in processing sorghum so that we can get that protein and the energy back into the animal agriculture space while still producing enough biofuel in a way that fits our local production agriculture. And I think that's really the thing that becomes important is these are localized systems, and it has to have a local focus. There are no blanket approaches to resilience and sustainability. It has to be based upon the local set of drivers. And and the other thing, if it don't make dollars, it won't make sense. If we start with this from the economic standpoint for the farmers and think about what's that incremental improvement that adds productivity while reducing the footprint, then we found a sweet spot. And we can use these carbon intensity metrics and these sort of things to really tell the story of production agriculture to people that maybe not be basic in farming. So I think when you get to that point, farmers are really proud of the things they do and really entrepreneurial. It's how do we create a common language that lets us integrate with other supply chains, but actually tell the story of efficiency of production agriculture.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, that's fascinating, this idea of having a common language, because we know across agricultural landscapes how varied and different they can be and how all the programs and systems need to take into account local systems, local drivers, local environmental conditions and soils. So I think that's an important theme to think about as we talk through this. So Susie, from your perspective, what are some additional key intersection points that you'd like to highlight from your experience working in these spaces?
Yeah, I just building on everything that Matt was talking about, I think one of the most important points of intersection is just the fact of a common landscape and common set of producers that are producing both for the feed sector and for the biofuel sector across corn and soy and sorghum and some other crops. And so the policies and the market signals that are right now so siloed for feed and for biofuels create so many challenges for that common production landscape and that common set of producers that are feeding into both of these markets. And so the more there can be alignment across what those policies and what those markets are asking for, and as you were just pointing out, Matt, create more alignment and unity in terms of how to enhance the resilience of that production landscape so we can be producing in a resilient way over a longer period of time. And so from our perspective, looking at how do we bring for both of those markets diversification into the landscape that enhances the long-term productivity of corn and soy and sorghum, that enhances the soil health for that landscape, addresses land use change, keeping prime farmland in farming, and preventing conversion of grasslands and other habitats enhances efficiency in that landscape. And if we can have the policies and the markets and the partnerships across both feed and biofuels do that in more aligned ways instead of in silos that are often asking for different things, I think we'll get a lot farther in more unified ways.
Thank you. I think, yeah, aligning policies and market signals across what are often perceived as distinct supply chains creates some of the barriers that's preventing additional investment into these outcomes at the landscape scale. I think, and I think we'll sort of maybe circle back to that a little bit later on this conversation in terms of what are some of the market signals we can look for to help remove some of those barriers. But I think maybe Susie, I'll stick with you on this next question, which is, from your perspective, what are you looking to achieve and accomplish by focusing on these specific supply chains that we're discussing? How we integrate both the feed supply chain with the biofuel supply chain. We understand that has a large impact across large landscapes, a big impact on food security and energy security. But from your perspective, what are you looking to achieve and accomplish by focusing on bringing these supply chains together?
Couple of bits, so I'll put them into kind of two categories. One, and I've already mentioned some of the things that we'd like to see in terms of how that landscape is managed. One, you've already brought up, I think bringing in more landscape scale management will be an enormous step forward. And that's also one thing that would bring together managing things, whether it's going into biofuels or into the feed supply chain, and create more flexibility in terms of, there's already quite a bit of flexibility from the producer standpoint, but enhance the coordination across the two in terms of the value chains. But there's such a need to focus in on keeping agricultural lands in agriculture, whether those are prime farm, keeping the farming lands, the crop lands in cropping, keeping grasslands and other habitats in habitat. And there's a lot of need for investment and support to be able to do that. As I mentioned, increasing diversification in the landscape within that production of corn and soy and sorghum, enhancing adoption of practices that enhance resilience and soil health in the face of more extreme weather, and also advance precision conservation, those lower producing areas of the field that are actually losing farmers money, but if they were put into perennial crops or longer term conservation, vegetation habitat, would actually earn farmers more money, and then enhance the resilience of the landscape overall. And doing this at a landscape level, you really put the most productive parts, keep those really producing well, and put habitat where it can really do the most good, and bring in the technical assistance that is needed to be able to support this at the landscape level, coordinate across programs and the partnerships that can really advance this at scale. So those are some of the things that we'd like to see happen.
Thank you, Susie. I think the theme around farmer resilience and keeping farms and farmland and in farms is an important driver for some of this. And Matt, we've discussed previously how supply chains really should not be considered silo when we think about feed supply chains and biofuel supply chains. And you touched on that briefly in your introduction, but would be interesting for you to maybe share your perspective on meeting farmers where they're at, how this systems-based approach can help local economies, local circular economies, to help lead to farmlands and farms staying as farms in the future. And are there any specific examples from your experience in working in this space that you'd like to highlight?
I think Susie's point on alignment is a really important one in the broad landscape. Those two things are really key in this discussion. So most of my career in ethanol, 50% of the footprint of ethanol produced happens outside of the biorefinery. If you look at animal agriculture, we're probably closer to 70% outside of the confined feeding operation. So that natural tether comes back to the farm. And that broader approach that Susie referenced as well, these partnerships that can address hey, that area of the field that maybe is a playa in this part of the country that's not productive, that has tremendous benefit to wildlife diversity, at the same time, we have an opportunity to make the whole farm more efficient and more productive by looking collaboratively. I think is a really key common thread here. The other challenge we have, and I think it's a universal challenge, is farmers probably don't have as much data at their fingertips as people would think they do. It's not that they're data adverse at all, but without high quality data, it's harder to make those precision decisions, right? So you call them shoebox accountants, silage pile accountants, knowing that hey, overall my operation was productive and profitable, but sometimes it's hard to tease that out at the subfield level. So as we add information in, we actually add a decision tool in. And there's so much technology out here that can help. It can be overwhelming at times, but when you start to hone in and said, hey, I planted X hybrid, and that hybrid maybe had 2 points more starch than a competitive hybrid. Well, when you think about that, that's taking 3% less land mass or bushels to produce that same bushel, a gallon of ethanol. And when we think about the scale that we're doing biofuels out, that's a really powerful number. I think the same thing is true in animal agriculture. The things we need for poultry and pork producers are different than beef and dairy. And when we start to think about aligned supply chains with better data, we naturally become more efficient. When you think about 3 or 5%, those are really big numbers. We've seen that in the ethanol plants already as we've started to fractionate distillers grains because it's a perfectly imperfect pile, right? We have the most efficient utilizers of fiber fraction are in beef and dairy, but those yeast and high quality proteins maybe find more value in pets or aquaculture or monogastric, certainly, right? So as we pull those out, we become more targeted and the whole system becomes more efficient because anything that ends up on the pen floor is quite literally wasted, right? So we look for those efficiency points. And I think just the distiller's grain component is a good place for demonstrating how we can layer these two things together. Compound that with when we actually measure nitrogen or we bring in maybe a split fertilizer application where we can make that economic decision from the farm gate when we know a little more about the crop. You know, if it doesn't rain in this part of the country, our yield forecast can change by 50 or 70%. So we can time that investment separately where we can also get it in the right form where the plant can uptake it. And that's not only economically beneficial, but it's also beneficial from an ecological standpoint because we're allowing the soils to be more productive. When you layer those things together, it hits the bottom line, but also it's a compelling story to tell. And that's regardless of crop, it's regardless of cropping system. And you have to think about the whole landscape. Back to Susie's point, I think it's really powerful is that all these things operate in systems. These silos can't exist because that's not reality in production agriculture. And looking at it a crop at a time or even a year at a time, it just doesn't tell the whole story and doesn't allow you to think, hey, who's the other partner that we might bring in? You know, where's the natural intersection where an NGO like WWF can provide that technical assistance or that background? You know, we do a lot of works with Ducks Unlimited out here. You know, like sorghum and ducks, man, that doesn't seem to line up, right? But those guys really are looking at those playas as a major opportunity for those migratory birds, and they do a really good job of technical assistance. And they understand that achieve their outcomes, they need to look at this from a landscape level as well, because they may only be interested in a 5 or 10 acre part of a section of land that has a tremendous benefit to the overall system. So I think these partnerships, the systems approach, everything that Susan's saying really hits home for me because we have to align the overall vision, but we have to do it across the landscape.
Thank you, Matt. I think, you know, your comments about small improvements in efficiency, like a 3 or 5% improvement using a particular hybrid, coupled with the concept of, you know, keeping farms and farmland, building more landscape level resilience. As we have those small incremental improvements, right, we decrease the likelihood of other land use changes and getting back to the landscape approach of thinking about the landscape as a unit, understanding farmer resilience and economic resilience, where these 3 or 5% gains can be significant, and how that actually unfolds across the landscape, I think is a very important way to think about these shared landscapes, right? There's all these little pieces that come together that can reduce some of the drivers of some of the outcomes that we're trying to avoid in certain cases, right? Whether it's loss of farmland, loss of critical habitat. and just better sort of environmental outcomes at the landscape level. So I think maybe it's good to maybe pivot to, some opportunities for collaboration across these supply chains. So we have, general understanding of what some of the issues are. From both of your perspectives, what are the key opportunities that exist to make this happen? Like, how can we, move beyond the siloed approach, move toward a landscape level assessment of the value that everybody's providing in that landscape within these various supply chains? So maybe Susie, if you want to provide your perspective on what are some of the key opportunities to move this forward, that would be great.
Sure. Well, one thing I think is important to highlight are there's a whole web of things that I think enhance progress on both biofuels and feed, and the opportunities to bring them together and make progress on both. And I think we've seen a lot of really valuable investment in the past few years, and continuing that I think is really important. One, and Matt, you brought this up, the measurement and data collection, and continuing to have investment in tools and technologies and platforms and data initiatives to collect the data and enhance our ability to track and measure and document outcomes and performance, I think is really important. And that contributes to the ability to, one, track and enhance initiatives at a landscape scale, but also document and reward performance for a variety of outcomes, including a variety of important resilience outcomes that benefit producers, but benefit the communities in that landscape. And so that is really important. Technical assistance systems are so important to supporting producer outcomes, but also enhancing our ability to act in shared ways across landscapes. And then being able to connect those to both the producers and those that are sourcing from those landscapes, and both the technical assistance and the ability to track and allocate outcomes further enhances and brings different members of the corporate sector together to act in shared ways in landscapes, where if they can act jointly in a shared landscape, but then be able to know, okay, which part is the credit for them in those outcomes for enhancing performance, I think we have a much better chance of advancing these shared landscape approaches that can enable everybody to act with much more efficiency by acting in joint ways. So those are a few ways that I think are really important to think about in terms of being able to continue to advance progress in shared landscapes. And then, just which we brought up before, the partnerships. And I think that involves the producers and producer organizations, NGOs, the corporate sector, and important agencies that are a really important part of this landscape.
Thank you, Susie. So Matt, I'll pass the same question off to you. I mean, we've talked about, documenting outcomes, understanding outcomes at the landscape scale, the need for technical assistance, as well as how partnerships can help, unlock this shared value chain. From your experience, what would you like to, elaborate on these opportunities or add additional opportunities for helping us make this happen?
Sure. I think from a farmer's point of view, and I'll start there, market signals mean a lot, right? Policy is important, but knowing that the people that my output is going to care is a big piece of this. And understanding what matters to them will directly impact how I handle things. I always like to talk about what certified Angus beef did to the entire beef industry 40 years ago. We saw a market signal that there was a premium for a product, and we actually saw farmers respond to that quicker than the genetics could actually match up. They changed feed systems to hit the target because they saw somebody downstream care. I think that becomes the impetus for how these partnerships form. Sitting here in Southwest Kansas, I'm not close to a lot of these consumer brands. I'm not seeing the things that are driving maybe a General Mills, maybe it's Hill's Pet Food, those people downstream that are being marketed through our retailers. But when you put the right supply chain partners together or the right collaboration, you reach into those. But we've been working with Dairy Farmers of America and General Mills and Ducks and Alltech to think about how do these systems impact the final products, and what are these stories and what are the metrics that really impact value throughout the supply chain. And when you do that, you can build some really powerful consortiums to make change and to sit across the table from the farmers and say, hey, these are the things that our consumers care about. I know as a wheat farmer here, there's a good deal of our product going to end up in a General Mills loaf someplace or in multigrain Cheerios or something along those lines, right? So when I hear from them that these are the things that matter, it's easier for me to get on board with moving in that direction. In our part of the country, water is such a critical resource, and I don't know that it gets enough airtime in terms of a priority. You never have to explain to a farmer why they care about water. And ethanol really has a valuable spot in that. The opportunities for reuse of water around these industrial plants that are already largely food grade or feed grade is tremendous. And we can work those in with the municipalities, with the animal feeding operations, and still have water left for agriculture here locally, in the row crop sense. So thinking about these integrated approaches to water conservation is first and foremost top of mind here. And then we think about, hey, what does that do to a cropping system or a feeding system? We've gotten really good at being super efficient with feeding corn in this part of the country, and rightly so. It's a great feedstock. But as we look at reducing our water footprint, we've got to challenge some of those paradigms. And maybe it's how much of the local feed stuff has to be grown here versus what can be imported from the United States, right? So if we're going to make shifts in those feeding systems, we've got to de-risk it, both for animal agriculture and for the farmer feeder. So bringing partners together that care becomes a really important part of that. One of the projects we're working on with General Mills, they're looking at, hey, what's the impact of integrating livestock on wheat in the spring? It makes tremendous fodder for these developing cattle. Well, growing cattle outside of confinement in the winter here is reducing the total amount of water we need to feed them through the system. High Plains Feed Yard here just west of where I live has done a lot of work in this, just piloting these animal development ways. They may be a little bit out of mainstream right now, but they're thinking about how do we do this with less and still have that same high quality product that the consumer demands. Working with DFA and the work that they've already done in this sense to say, how do we do more with less? Is that a different forage system? If we go to a winter grass and then have maybe a low water crop like sorghum silage in the summer, when we get that same unit of output on less total water here. And then you see the technology providers come in. There's a new kernel processing system for sorghum silage. Sorghum silage has long had a challenge with the grain just bypassing through because we couldn't get it processed. You see that integration of technology. There's a DuraCut system, which John Deere is helping to move now. Well, it's solving a problem. And when you can present the opportunities and efficiency, coupled with something that's reducing a pain point for farmers, they're all open ears. So you sit there and you say, well, I've got somebody that cares about my wheat output. I've got an ethanol plant and a feeder that really care about maybe my corn or my sorghum output, and I've got a place to go with the fodder. And these are people, along with the NGOs like WWF or Ducks Unlimited, that are looking at, hey, I care about the habitat around here. I'm willing to bring you resources. Farmers saying like, hey, I'm a really important part of this bigger picture, and I see how the people that are the end users of my products are moving in this direction. And I need to understand how I align my operation with those supply chains. And I think it builds a really robust conversation. And there's got to be a lot of candor in them too, because it can't be prescriptive from the top down. It's got to be a sitting down and listening to say, what is it that works on your farm? Hey, here's something novel that we've documented in a trial space or in a pilot space in your region. Are you willing to try whatever this might be? And it may not be the big sexy change overnight, but it's the incremental change that can make a tremendous impact, because we can do it at such a large scale because we're not taking on so much risk, or we're piloting these things in a way that can scale behind that really also tells the story of production agriculture and how there's support for everybody on this call in a unique way, where the farmer may not get outside of their backyard very often, but when they have these resources brought to them and a bigger picture presented, I think they're really open to that discussion. And that's particularly the case as, the average age of the farmer is reaching retirement age right now, and they're bringing young people back to the farm. And you've got a fresh set of ears and eyes that are like, hey, how might this look different in the next generation that has? We're nearing that kind of time frame with my dad's generation and me and one of my cousins. It's like, okay, I understand the changes we've made, and they've been pretty dramatic in the last 40 years. But what's this look like in the next 30 years to meet the needs of the consumer products, but also to add efficiency to where we know we have this to pass it on to my kids? And I think it's a complex discussion, but when you break it down to those individual pieces and say, hey, what's our overall outcome and who's the partner that best complements me, these things can come together pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I mean, I think that brings together some of the earlier discussion around we need sort of a common language. We need to understand, landscapes are quite varied from one landscape to the other. Your point about water in Kansas is, hits home, and also just the idea about thinking about integrating cattle into a sorghum wheat rotation and realizing water benefits of that. I mean, that's something that I don't think the broader community would understand. I think it's part of sort of educating the broader community how landscape specific programs have multiple benefits, like the water issue that you raised associated with integrating cattle into that system. So I think we're seeing that there's opportunities for market drivers to help facilitate that, as long as there's a common language, as long as they're aligned to landscape needs. One question I have is, there's been recent policy developments. Have those policy developments sort of hampered or helped in building these kinds of collaborations that we've been discussing around ecosystem attributes, ecosystem services? I'd be curious to get both of your thoughts on this. Maybe start with Susie.
Sure. I think some of the things that have really helped have been the pretty significant increase in investment we've seen over the past few years in measurement, data collection technologies to help track outcomes. I think that's a really important component. There's also been a lot more investment in innovation projects and public-private partnerships. And I think that has been really key. Another area where I think there's been more investment, but we need a lot more, is in that technical assistance network. We've seen progress, but we still I think there's room for even more innovation in how partners are brought into that equation, and how innovations in technology can help bring information out, connect farmers into networks, have farmers sharing information across networks of farmers in terms of things they're learning and they're seeing. So I think that policy has helped and has moved the ball forward. I think there's enormous value in continuing to make sure that we foster that. I think there's also been innovation in terms of how tax incentives and other innovations can help catalyze sustainable biofuels markets, and innovation grants that have helped look at how to further advance sustainability in livestock feed. Again, these are places where bringing things together at a landscape level, trying to bring those industries together more, will be really helpful. They've still been relatively siloed, but we've seen a lot of really positive investments, still progress to be made, but being able to continue along that pathway will be really valuable.
Yeah, I think similarly. There's a lot of momentum in this space, and I think we'd be remiss if we don't address the 45Z tax credits in this discussion, right? Because the opportunity they provide to really accelerate a lot of these things. And I think when you think about biofuels and unleashing American energy, they fit together so well. Ethanol is already commercially viable, and it's such a big part of the farm economy. when you layer together the things that we can do with innovative farm practices going into these biorefineries to extend the fuel supply, and even being a very powerful position as a net exporter because you're utilizing the octane and ethanol to unleash the energy in those fossil fuels. Those discussions become really important. And if we can get 45Z to a point where we're accounting for these farm practices, the opportunity to really button up these supply chains is so strong. And it's probably the biggest opportunity in production agriculture that we've seen in a generation for accelerating these supply chain alignments, which will then build further efficiency. That to me is probably the biggest button. Obviously, nobody likes uncertainty in a time of change, even if you believe in the long-term vision. So there's some challenges in the short run. I don't think anybody would dismiss that. When you think about the momentum it's created, that the focus in the last decade around NASA, NASA acres is such an interesting opportunity. We spent all this money in our space program, and the things that can do for real decision tools at the farm gate in the next 5 to 10 years are really impressive. And that allows us incremental progress because you're feeding farmers better in-season data to make those decisions. And that's something that gets overlooked a lot of times. But how do we take this problem with asymmetric information out of the marketplace? Large grain traders have had a lot of opportunity there over time. Well, as we provide more information to farmers, that policy decision to invest in this remote sensing provides a valuable tool that emboldens farmers. And then with these integrated supply chains, we can get 45Z to happen. They're hearing from the ethanol plant or for the biodiesel plant, hey, I need this characteristic. And we're no longer talking about commodities. We're talking about ingredients, supply ingredients, right? And we're tailoring these systems so that they're so much bolder. And I think the other thing that we have seen here in short order is in times of uncertainty, the major companies in these supply chains are willing to step up and say, this is still important to us. And the farmers are maybe hearing that direct signal stronger than they did before, because you're seeing them show up and say, hey, we're still going to move this forward. We still want to absolutely involve the programs. And I think to Susie's point on technical assistance, there's even more opportunities for public-private partnerships right now, but in the conservation arena, making sure that it's in a language and a manner that's accessible to farmers so they can really understand, and that we can make the data sharing more efficient through the supply chain. We bring technology into that. It's crazy on our farm today, and this is a little bit of a divergence. I got to go draw on a map and take it to our insurance guy on how many acres we have. Then I take that same thing into FSA. And if I'm in an NRCS program, I'm doing that again. The opportunity to use the technology that's already here to make that more efficient, to use organizations like World Wildlife Fund or even National Sorghum Producers to help with these conservation efforts in a way that we get more total dollars back to the farmers because we're doing it in an efficient manner. The timing is right. And with those, we can leverage these partnerships to go even further. So uncertainty, yes, but I feel like there's really good momentum here. And I think every farmer needs to understand the opportunity that 45Z does, not only in the tax credits up front and the economic opportunity, but what that can do for their supply chains over time. And I think it can be really impactful.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. I think you raised some key points around the value of policies and how uncertainty can create maybe lack of action at certain points in time, but also opportunities, right? As you mentioned, some of the larger companies are stepping in to try to sort of help keep this moving forward, while the policies around 45Z sort of come into focus. So I also think on the policy side, given we're talking about shared landscapes where biofuel and feed support both the biofuel side of outcomes, but also ecosystem services and carbon outcomes, we need to think about the policies around how we do the allocation across those shared landscapes, right? Because each individual investment they'll make those investments if they can have clarity around what it is that's being created for their investment. And that has to do with the allocation, right, in these shared value chains. So I think that's something that I'm sort of very interested in on the carbon policy side is something that will help unlock more investment in these shared landscapes. So you'd have the government policies, but also ecosystem service market policies that will create more value for the farmers in the end, right? Because as you say all the time, we need to meet the farmers where they are. So And we've talked a little bit about technologies and economic opportunities for farmers. I would love to get both of your opinions on, there's clearly operations for collaboration across these supply chains, but they have to work for farmers. So are there other things that we need to do to make it easier for them? We've talked a little bit about technology as a potential way, clarity on policies. Are there other things we need to do to help, enable farmers to benefit from these shared landscapes?
I'll reiterate the technical assistance
Yep.
piece. The clarity on the ask is always going to be really important, and the more that can be outcome focused so that the producers can choose the most relevant ways in their context to meet that outcome objective. It's at some point it comes down to what practices they implement on their farm, but avoiding checklists and being as performance focused as possible creates the most opportunity for innovation and efficiency in how producers meet that, and being able to do that in a landscape way, as opposed to, okay, each farmer is going to do a checklist and it just plays out in their region. It can really look at, okay, what is going to be most effective across that landscape, and then having the programs in place to be able to support that, but having that come from the private sector, from NGOs, from public sector programs, ideally in a consistent way, having them change every few years, having funding fluctuate, having the ask fluctuate. It's the farmers that is most difficult on, because at minimum, Matt, I don't need to tell you this, agriculture plays out over an entire season. And even changing from one season to the next is a big ask. I mean, you've got investments in equipment and a whole lot more than that. So it takes a lot of planning. It doesn't change really, really quickly. So being able to support the long-term planning that takes, agriculture's time horizons and that of policy play out at very different scales. So bringing that into alignment, meaning policy having a much longer time horizon and sticking to it would be super helpful. So that reiterated a lot of things, but I think in some ways that's important. There's some core things that are really needed, I think.
So I'll reiterate one too. I said earlier, if it don't make dollars, it won't make sense. And when we think about how we bridge these systems, and I'll focus just on co-products, we haven't changed the co-product credit in ethanol since 2009. And these feedstuffs look completely different. The animal genetics look completely different than they did. The way we utilize them look completely different. But that use case is such an important piece of this. So if we go back to the economic value being the denominator and saying, how do we split that? Or if we want to use the economic output per unit of water, per unit of carbon, we have a tangible thread that we can go across systems. And you think about how you impact the overall. The good thing is efficiency is apolitical, right? Efficiency is less policy related because it stands on its own 2 feet. And it's such an important story to tell, and one that we in production agriculture do a really poor job of telling a lot of times. You think about all the years national corn growers and national cattlemen's beef spent beating heads on ethanol policy to realize, hey, the impetus of production agriculture are well-funded and find media time really easily. And a lot of that's behind us at this point in time. And now it's like, how do we tell about the efficiency of our systems and how we here in the United States really do it better than anybody else in the world? Large scale anyway. There's not the competitive countries, but by and large, we're the most efficient producers of almost any agriculture commodity anywhere in the world. And there's still so much opportunity to do more, to be better, right? But through this discussion we've been having. So how do we find that common denominator that lets us talk across industries? Ethanol and the American Petroleum Institute have finally understood, hey, ethanol is an important ingredient into gasoline. right? It is the oxygenate that makes it more efficient. It's the lowest carbon piece of that. But ethanol by itself needs the energy from gasoline to be better. And this story is so much more compelling when we tell it together. The same thing is true of the beef story with the ethanol story. Each piece of that is such a more compelling story from a holistic, from a landscape level approach, just like we started on earlier. And I think that is how we move this conversation forward. It's telling the integrated story, telling how not only we save water, we also improve livestock or wildlife habitat. We improve productivity of the lands that we're on, all in a way that's reducing the environmental footprint while improving the output per whatever metric we're going to have.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's clear that we've talked about policies and biofuel markets as the driver, ecosystem service markets as the driver, how data and technologies can help create information that can inform a common language to work more focused on these shared landscapes. And we've talked about, farmer resilience in these systems. I think another theme that I would like to just briefly touch on is this idea around sustainability and risk management under a changing climate, right? So you've got the direct benefits of these products for both carbon and biofuels, but related to this sustainable management is, do we de-risk yield variability so we have better farmer economic resilience, we have better supply chain resilience for providing that. So if either of you would like to sort of provide a few comments on how we can bring together insurance and financial interests to help support that resilience, would be, I think, another way of bringing investment to benefit the farmers for implementing these systematic changes across the landscape.
Yeah, I think that is a really key part of this bill, and there are really significant opportunities from the risk perspective through crop insurance, through finance, through banking and loans, to look at bring in a lot of data that is already available and bring that into the consideration for all of those things, for crop insurance, for financing, for loans, the benefit of what is grown where, and the value of conservation practices to enhancing the resilience of production, and looking at it from a very data-driven perspective, and what is going to enhance the resilience of production in a given landscape. And as we're looking at how weather patterns and climatic patterns are going to be changing over time, what's going to be most suitable where, and so what are going to be the greatest opportunities for adaptation for production in that landscape, and provide information to producers to enable them to make decisions with that information, and have the finance system support them in those decisions. I think the system right now has a lot of history from where it comes from, and locks into a handful of crops, and to best support producers economically and from a resilience perspective going forward, bringing in that information about the benefits of conservation practices, and how the conditions that we're going to be operating in are going to be changing, bringing those into the equation for farmers making decisions, and enabling them to make decisions, and having the system support them in that from a financial perspective, will be really beneficial. And so how do we adapt the crop insurance system, the finance system to support that? Are somewhat open questions, somewhat, a lot of folks working on that, but I think those are really needed.
So I'll take this kind of two directions. One, monocultures just don't work over time, right? They'd be economically viable in the short run, but it adds so much risk. And as we build soil health, we know the lands become more resilient. They can improve water infiltration rates, that the soil health is just generally better, but they're also more economically diverse. Bill, you and I are working together on a project with General Mills, and I think as a large wheat buyer, it's really instructive that they're interested in looking at a landscape where we have wheat and sorghum and livestock integrated into that. Well, the value of that from an economic standpoint for the producer is I have three different crops that I wouldn't have in a monoculture wheat system that all have their own supply and demand considerations, but it's diversifying risk, it's sharing risk. And that should be attractive to a banker because I don't have all my eggs in one basket. At the same time, we have the ecological benefits of livestock integration that go along with spreading the timing risk of moisture, right? We could have an extreme drought for a narrow period of a window or extreme heat. They could take out one of those crops. The odds of taking out all three of those revenue sources significantly less, not zero, but it helps, right? So when we think about it from that standpoint, diversity helps. Then I'm gonna go back to water. And you're already seeing this in the major ag lenders. If you're operating this, you have to have a water plan that shows that you're viable, that you can reach Q stable, which is an interesting metric here in Kansas. If you're going to have a loan that goes out 15 or 20 years, you better have a plan that your water it can last beyond that, or we're going to shorten up the terms or add more risk capital into this. Water is probably the easiest one to do it, but the more data we can provide, whether it be for bankers or insurance companies, the better we can be. And that goes back to the ag data discussion. And I know Regro has done a lot of work in this discussion as well, but you need good data on planting dates and on yields to be able to inform those actuary models, because that's all insurance is, right? It's a risk paradigm. So with poor data, you're going to have poor insurance products. With good data, we can have good insurance products. And that allows us to take that step further. Anything that goes to government is going to be slow to pivot. RMA is going to be slower, but there is some private insurance products that fit well on the side, and some move in finance already to offer favorable rates to people that are pushing this because they see it as de-risking the overall operation by having some diversity in their feedstuffs as a feeder dairy operator or in their output as a local farmer. So I do think you're seeing movement. It takes a while, but it's got to be very data driven because at God we trust, everybody else bring data, right?
Excellent. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Susie. I think we've had a broad discussion about all of the factors influencing these shared landscapes, and we're coming up on time. So maybe I'll give you each an opportunity if you want to, have some parting words, and then we'll hand it back to Eleni to discuss wrapping up the webinar. But any parting words you wish to provide? Thank you again for all your insights.
I so appreciate being able to be a part of this discussion. And I think these are just such important issues that we really need to tackle. These are really large landscapes here in the US and in other countries, and enhancing the resilience of production is so important for the economic viability and livelihoods of the producers that are on that landscape and to our food and agricultural system. So we need to get this right, and it's on all of us. It's a full value chain responsibility. So hoping that there are a lot of us that chip in and are here for the long haul.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to participate as well. I think it's really interesting where Susie and I's organizations may start from a different spot, how many of these things we come together on. And I would encourage every farmer, think about who your customer is and how are their needs shifting. What is it that they want today that you can already do that move in that direction? But then it's each of us as players within the broader system, broader landscape, who's the partner that complements us? And don't be afraid to get outside the box in figuring out how we provide a holistic system that moves the ball forward. Don't wait on government policy. Do the things that make sense right now and try to use these pilots, these projects to inform government policy in a way that makes sense for everybody. And every time I'm in front of a group of farmers, I tell them, whether you like it or not, you're in the data business now. You can embrace it or you can fight it, but it's reality. And there's tremendous opportunities for people that embrace their data system to tell their story and integrate with their supply chain.
Well, thank you both so much. I think we may have time for questions on the Q&A, so I'll pass it back to Eleni to tee that up.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Bill, Susie, and Matt. Really appreciate your insights over the last hour here. We have received a couple questions, and since we have a few minutes, I will force you to answer them. Todd asks, what can state departments of agriculture do to help educate farmers and organize waste biomass farm supply chains? What can we do smarter right now with ag government and value chain biomass collection?
A little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but I'll say, we've had tremendous challenges with trying to go down the route of cellulosic ethanol. There's a lot of challenges in material handling. But when you look at some of the things that can be done with gasification and biochar that naturally fit into the broader supply chain already, I think that's a place to look at. Regionally where you're at, that matters a good deal. But in my time at ICM, we developed a gasifier that was capable of firing the entire ethanol plant off of waste biomass around. There's a lot of good biochar projects underway that have real tangible benefits to soil health in conjunction with solving a waste problem. So far from an expert in that, but I think that those are the arenas I'd look at first because they can be symbiotic with so many things probably in that local area already.
Yeah, I would agree.
Great. Another question. Have either of you, Susie or Matt, seen early examples of CPG-driven market signals that are similar to the Angus beef example, but for things like feed or fuel?
In terms of certification?
Yeah, I believe so.
I'll take a low-hanging fruit. We do quite a bit of work with Carbon A List, and Danone is a significant partner of theirs, already making real water commitments and pulling these things through. Obviously, the organic market, it kind of speaks for itself, but the opportunity to do so in moving in that direction. I also brought up General Mills a couple of times here, and they're very committed to their 2030 goals and doing the things that it takes to move along that. General Mills has a 1,000,000-acre regenerative ag goal by 2030, and they're looking for the small hanging piece of this to move that forward, whether that be an organic cropping system or just the producer support and technical service they need, but building out the models in a way that works locally and providing some economic incentive to do so. In the biofuels arena, Conestoga Energy here in Western Kansas paying premiums for certified bushels that allow them to go into Europe with feedstocks. And then, of course, 45Z providing tremendous opportunity to align several of those things. But people trying to push that envelope, saying, hey, what's the thing that really starts to move the needle? How do we pay for premiums? You see it quite a bit in animal agriculture. The beef supply chain is probably the best in terms of the prime choice select, that quality grade already driving the market outcomes. You see a lot of that in dairy as well, where you're paying for butter, fat, and protein and allowing those supply chains, both the genetics in the animals and the feedstuffs and the way they're feeding those to align with that, providing that next step. I think we're going to see that in sorghum silage. Not to be too much of a homer here, but I'll put that plug in, where we can align the genetics of the crop with the outcomes the animal feeder needs. Do we need a higher digestible forage? Do we need more protein? Beginning with the end in mind is really impactful, and a few dollars an acre goes a long ways.
And I would just echo, I think there are a lot of companies that are setting goals and developing procurement policies to try to meet those goals. A little different than the certification that was mentioned with the Angus beef. But then there are also organizations and companies like Gevo in the biofuels that have very, kind of very detailed programs and procurement policies. So I think there are some good examples out there.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you both for your answer. We've run out of time, though there were a couple more questions submitted. So if you submitted a question that didn't get answered, or if you still have an outstanding question that you haven't yet submitted, feel free to reach out to us on that. But otherwise, thank you, Susie, Bill, Matt, for your time and for your insights. And thanks to all of you for joining us and submitting your questions. We will send the recording of this webinar to registrants this week. So whether you attended or just registered for the webinar, you'll be receiving a recording. And if you have any questions about our work in these spaces, please do reach out to us directly via the email that's up on our screen, or you can find us on LinkedIn. Thank you again for your time and for such a robust discussion, and have a great day, everyone.